Now, faith as a noun, and this translates the Greek word pistis, pistis. And this often refers to that which evokes trust and faith, that which evokes trust and faith. And this definition and following definitions will largely be taken from a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature. Done by, it's commonly referred to as BDAG, which is the Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich, the persons who are most noted for compiling and editing, being the main editors for this Greek-English lexicon. But they define pistis as that which evokes trust and faith. Now, the word is used with reference to God himself, who is regarded as trustworthy, obviously. I think of Romans 3:3. It says, "What then if some did not believe? Their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God." And the word faithfulness there translates our Greek noun pistis. And so here it talks about that that characteristic of God who is faithful. Also in Romans 4:19 through 21, which reads, "Without becoming weak in faith," here talking about Abraham, "without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb." Now this is referring back to when God told Abram and Sarah that they would have a son, a child. And at the time, Abraham was 100 years and Sarah was 90. And so it says here that without becoming weak in faith, in other words, his faith did not diminish, he contemplated his own body, which was not able to produce an heir. He says, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. And remember that the context, the historical biblical context, is that Sarah was 90, well past childbearing years. And so he thought about himself and he thought about Sarah's womb and he just thought, I can't do that. We can't do that. That's just, it can't be done. And yet, here's the tension. Abraham and Sarah, well, Abraham here he's thinking, we can't do that. But God made a promise. And so God made a promise that we would have a son. And so verse 20 says, yet with respect to the promise of God. So he's left here with this tension because God made a promise that they would have a son, and Abraham's looking at himself and Sarah and saying, it's not going to happen by our efforts, okay? He says, yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith. Grew strong in faith. Notice, being fully assured that what God had promised, he was able also to perform. That what God had promised, he was able also to perform. And so here we see it being used to that which evokes trust and faith. And here, again, the character of God. The word pistis is also used of people who possess faith. People who possess faith. Because again, when you think of a noun, you think of a person, place, or thing. And so like here in Matthew 9:2, it says, and they brought to him, that is to Jesus, a paralytic lying on his bed. And it says, seeing their faith, that is that they had faith. And then like in Matthew 9:22, but Jesus turning and seeing her said, daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well. And so it's used of people who possess faith. And faith, by the way, can be great. It can be great, small, or absent. Matthew 15, verse 28. Jesus said to her, O woman, your faith is great. And by the way, when you think about Abraham, Abraham grew strong in faith. His faith developed. And faith is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger you get. And that's just true. And by the way, when you're thinking about lifting weights, I used to work out decades ago. I don't work out anymore, at least not like I used to. I'd still do a few push-ups and sit-ups when I can. But when I used to work out years ago, you go to the gym and you're dealing with resistance, and the more resistance you can get, the more muscle you can develop, because that's how it works. So you need this resistance. Well, with Abraham, what was the resistance? It was his own body not being able to produce a child, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. So that's the resistance, and yet the promise exists. So the question is, what are you going to go with? Are you going to go with your own ability, or are you going to trust God at His word? And the more that we exercise faith, the more we learn to live by faith, the more that faith grows. And so faith can be absent. People are said to, be without faith. And sometimes that's just in the situation. Doesn't mean they don't have the capacity. It just means in that situation they're just not believing. But faith can be small. Faith can be great. And we're not neutral. You see, we play a role in that. So as we begin to take our walk seriously with the Lord, and we begin to advance to maturity, our walk of faith, develops. But Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great." And so here he's using, again, the noun pistis. But the word faith translates the Greek word megos. Megos. And we see it like in the word megaphone. Megaphone. The word phone being voice. And so great here is how it's presented. Faith can also be small. Notice Matthew 17, verses 19 through 20. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not drive it out?" And he said to them, "Because of the littleness of your faith." Alagapista is the Greek word there. Because of the littleness of your faith. And faith can be absent. Faith can be absent. And notice in Mark 4, verses 39 to 40, "And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Hush, be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm." And you can imagine that situation with torrent waves all about and winds and, the boat being tossed here and there, and then Jesus getting up and says to the sea, "Hush, be calm." And immediately it's like glass. Just no wind, no waves. And of course, that's going to be quite amazing to see. But it says the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" Now this is just in that situation they had no faith. Again, they had capacity, it just wasn't being exercised. So it can be absent. Now, pistis as a noun is also used of Scripture as a body of reliable teaching. As a body of reliable teaching. Let me give you an example. Over in Galatians 1:23, it says, "But only they kept hearing," this Paul talking about his former manner of life, "he who once persecuted us," that is Saul, before his conversion, kept persecuting us, that is Christians, "that he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith." And the faith here is our Greek noun, pistis. And so in this context, it refers to a body of reliable teaching. So he's preaching the faith, that is content. He's communicating doctrine, Bible teaching. And so again, it is used here of a body of reliable teaching. By the way, one of the things that you'll notice when I'm doing these sorts of word studies, and we are doing word studies, by the way, through a lot of this, is that we always want a word to be defined by its context, because context determines the meaning of a word. And so it's how that word appears in its context that we are able to derive the meaning. Where that becomes difficult is if we have words that appear very infrequently in the Bible. We have some words that appear only once, and that's called a hapax legomenon. A hapax legomenon, a word that appears only once in the Scripture. And when that happens, we're kind of at a loss. We do look at extra-biblical literature, if that's available. We look at outside sources. But those are not to be treated the same as the biblical sources. So the more a word is used, the more context we have to look at. And so that helps flesh out the nuances of a word, what's called the semantic range of a word, the semantic range. And the semantic range refers to the range of meanings that it can have depending on its context. Now, and here I've got it in the passage, Paul was said to preach the faith he once tried to destroy. Richard Longenecker, and here I'm quoting from Word Biblical Commentary, volume 41, page 42, he says that Paul, quote, uses pistis in Galatians in an absolute sense to mean the content of the Christian gospel, end quote. And so he's absolutely correct when he's talking about the use of pistis there, to refer to the content of the Christian gospel.